Welcome, Father. Thank you for offering session 5. We're going to be focusing on the stages of the spiritual life, and in particular, the first stage. So we're happy to have you, Father Seely.
Thank you very much, sister, and welcome to everybody who's on this hookup. And I hope to now get into the real meat of the subject of how a Christian tries to proceed in the spiritual life. And as I mentioned before, it all starts with faith and baptism. And as I've also mentioned that. And I use this as a kind of a structure that once we're all baptized into the Catholic faith, we're actually children of infants in the faith. And the next stage, of course, as we grow up and grow older, is to try to take our faith and how we now understand it as adults and to proceed into the maturity of our faith. And really, this is what the spiritual life is all about. How do we become mature Christians? How do we become true disciples? How do we go out and evangelize the world? And so with spirituality, or those who try to meditate and to provide what they've gained from their own prayer life and perhaps even contemplative life. The whole idea here is how do we proceed and how do we understand how we are to proceed? Obviously, in simple terms, the life of the Christian is to go out and follow the teachings of Christ, the commandments, the Beatitudes, the works of mercy. And how do we keep improving ourselves and get closer to an intimacy with Christ and with the Holy, and hopefully to ultimately get to the final stage where we enter the world of God and the world of the Holy. So spiritual commentators and so forth are trying to help us to do this. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that how do we understand who we are as created beings? And it's interesting that both the East and the West kind of agree with each other, although they emphasize different points. And that's not surprising because, as most of you might know, the Western spirituality, in some ways, goes back to Cassian, John Cassian, who lived from 360 to 435, and he was very interested in the spiritual life, and so he spent quite a bit of time in Palestine. He came from perhaps the region of Romania, Bulgaria. Some think he was further over towards Marseille in France, where he did establish monasteries there. But he spent a lot of time in Jerusalem, and then also he went to the desert where the desert fathers were establishing monasteries, and brought the much of the teachings that they were advocating back to the West, and had an influence directly with Saint Benedict. So there is a lot of interaction between the East and the West. But the first thing to keep in mind is what is our anthropology? Who are we as created beings? And of course, if you follow the biblical view, the idea we get from Genesis is that human beings were created in the image and likeness of God. They have a body and soul. And as we continue in the scriptures, especially when you get into the New Testament, we also talk about the body, soul, and spirit. And so to get back to where I want to be here. In the spiritual life, with these different writers who went into depth about how one should live that life, the distinctions ended up being between how do you deal with the body, how do you deal with the soul, and how do you deal with the spirit. And so this is why we end up with the three different stages or levels or steps. Now, very important, though, is what happened in the history of spirituality. By that, I mean, first, you have the earliest writers in the Syriac world. One of the earliest writers, besides the ones I've been mentioning, and I did mention him also, was John the Solitary of Apamea. As I mentioned before, he lived in the 5th century, and he lived, as you know from his title, the Solitary. He was a hermit, but he also was someone involved with the monasteries in that area. And he wrote quite extensively to different monks and hermits, answering their questions and trying to provide spiritual advice and direction. What I like about John the Solitary, again, is that he, from my understanding of his writings, he never, he was aware of Greek philosophy and what was going on in the Greek world to an extent, but from my point of view, almost everything he says about the spiritual life, you could find cited somewhere in the scriptures. And so I don't think he really departed much from what I called before the biblical anthropology. And so to me, he's very easy to deal with because he's still dealing with very basic spiritual ideas and a basic understanding of the Syriac view of the human anthropology. Now, to me, and I'm going to probably be talking about this off and on, very important in the Syriac writers following John is the idea that the human body was part of the original creation. It was part of the divine plan. And so what happened with the failure of human beings, beginning with the first humans, is when sin began to develop and spread, the process of divinization, the process of getting into further the fruit of the spiritual life was put on hold. And so the problem there was that instead of the first human beings not sinning and somehow being in harmony with God, that was the way God intended from the start. But that since sin intrudes, and again intrudes because of human freedom, the humans had to be re-educated. I shouldn't even say re-educated. Had to be educated as to how they were going to achieve their spiritual goals. The point, though, I want to make is that in the biblical view, when we find this certainly in the New Testament, human beings, body and soul, are destined to a glorified life. And so the body is an integral part of the human makeup. And the body itself will exist through eternity in a different form, a resurrected, glorified body, just as we have in our Lord. So, so when you look at the Syriac side of things, the whole idea of the spiritual life, whether it be the first stages of asceticism and following the commandments and so forth, you're dealing with the idea of God through the revelation that took place in the scriptures and Christ, of how we bring our souls and bodies into harmony. And so, so this is the basic anthropology of John the Solitary and a lot of the other early Syriac writers. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to refer to a different anthropology, and that is the one by a gentleman we know as Evagrius of Pontus, and how he interpreted what the human makeup is like and why. But before we get to that point, I wanted to say a few more things about the Syriac side. Now, the idea here is that the soul and the body have to live with each other. They can't live apart from each other. By that I mean the body has its passions. The body has the senses. The life of the body, if I can put it that way, is completely dependent on the material world. And so for the body to stay alive, it has to deal with the material world. This is what it is essentially is. On the other hand, the soul can't live without the body. So the body can't live without the soul, because the soul has to direct the body not to injure itself and so forth. But the soul can become so preoccupied with the body, and the body itself having, as I said, its passions, and the soul itself is tempted by these passions, that what happens here is that there is a real struggle that goes on. And as we all know, more often than not, we lose track, and we get off the track and end up being more materialistic than we are spiritual. And so that is the kind of makeup between body and soul. On the other hand, the soul, its main function is knowledge, understanding, intellectual life. And as we mentioned before, what can happen is that once the body and the soul are in harmony, the soul itself can spend most of its activity in asking and answering questions and coming up with theories and trying to have more and more knowledge, and even imposing its own knowledge on what creation is, and perhaps its own knowledge being incomplete or distorted. And so the problem with the soul is that it has to find its own harmony with the body, but also with the plan of God. And so there can be, and we talked about this before, a tension between the soul wanting to focus on its own needs, without paying much attention further to the whole region of the spiritual or faith or the invisible world. And we find this a lot, and we've talked about this the last several talks, that some of the early spiritual writers were concerned of people being too intellectual, raising too many questions, coming up with too many doubts, trying to be more focused on the intellect more than anything else. And so this is part of what the tension is in this anthropology that we're talking about. John the Solitary also comes up with an interesting image about the human makeup. And he talks about the human being with body, soul, and spirit. And I should say a word or two about the spirit. The spirit, the human spirit, which is in the depths of our soul. The human spirit is what has the spark of the divine. And the human spirit is there for us to, if we can discipline ourselves enough and stay on the right track, we can begin to have some intimations of the invisible world. And so the example that John the Solitary uses is that of an embryo. right before it gets birth, it gets born. And with the embryo, he says it already has its all its fingers and toes and brain and senses and the already core of an intellectual side, but it can't function. It can't function, especially the spiritual side of the embryo, until it gets into the world itself. And so the problem then, once it gets into the world itself, the visible world, it has to be able to be freed to be its own essence, its own nature. And that is the ultimate challenge of the spiritual life. Can we so reach a harmony between body, soul, and spirit, where the spirit itself can have some intimations about what's going on in the world? So these are some of the aspects of the Syriac world. Now, with John the Solitary, he has his own 3 levels, and in Syriac, the one level is called the corporeal, the second is called the spirit, the soul level, and the third level is the spiritual level. So you got the psychic and the pneuma from Greek, the spirit, not just the soul as an intellect. And so, but in John the Solitary, when you read him, differing than the 3 stages we find in other ways of structuring the spiritual life, he uses the word corporeal, not in the sense of ascetical, but in the sense of being given over to the body. And so for him, the problem is that at this level, we're talking about the Christian or Catholic who is Catholic at the minimal level. In other words, someone who does show up in church sometimes and does manage to get his Easter communion in. But as I mentioned before, there are others who only show up when they're baptized, married, and buried. So for him, when he talks about the corporeal level, he's talking about the having a focus really on the material world, subject to jealousy, contentiousness, the division. He focuses on vanity, boastfulness, pride, anger, envy, hatred, malice. So there's all kinds of vices that you have on this corporeal level. He also even makes reference to the role that he sees played by the demons, who interfere also with the human existence, and that they try to also control human beings in order to have power on the world itself. But then he, as other spiritual writers have pointed out, that the demons are unable to see the soul. So they can't deal directly with the soul. And so the only way they can affect the soul, as he says, is if they are able to deal with the organs, the physical organs of the body in which the soul has to reside. So he gives us that kind of warning. Also, on this corporeal level for John the Solitary, there is the desire to seek power, honors, desire for accumulating material things. The problem also is that the corporeal people at the corporeal level also seem to be quite happy being in the world without thinking of anything else and having no fear of judgment. And they have no real interest in being taught or receiving any kind of religious education. So because of that, when persons on this level try to pray, their prayer is filled with distractions. And when they're dealing with God, they deal with God looking upon God anthropologically. By that I mean they see God as somebody to who you can deal with like on an earthly level. And as I've mentioned in other contexts, you deal with God transactionally. I'm going to do this for God if He does this for me. And so this is a real sign of what's wrong with that level of life. And now, but John also says that there can happen with God's grace where the person begins to realize that he or she is lacking in true wisdom and becoming a stranger to the mysteries of God. And the argument he uses is that, fortunately, down deep, with God's grace, these persons can begin to realize that there's a real treasure in who they are in the image and likeness of God that they have been not focusing on. So as I mentioned, I think last time, this is where the beginnings of hope and the beginnings of trying to change one's life comes into play. So this is some of the ideas we have with John the Solitary, with his biblically based idea of human anthropology. And the first level here of someone who is not yet ready, but is beginning to turn to convert to the true path. But very important to keep in mind, because I'm switching gears here, is that there is another figure, as I mentioned before, named Evagrius of Pontus, who has a Greek background of Greek spirituality, who, because of what his life story, had a profound influence on Syriac spirituality. So much so that when you get into the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries, a good part of his writings had a direct influence on Syriac spirituality and were translated into Syriac. And this is not surprising because when you study the various Eastern churches and the Western church, as I think I mentioned before, spirituality and art and culture cross boundaries. And so this is what happened here. But there's a fundamental difference with Evagrius than you have with John the Solitary. Evagrius certainly is influenced by the scriptures, but he is also influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy. And the one who had, regarding Evagrius, he came from Pontus, which is over there in the region of not too far from Constantinople. And he went and studied in Constantinople under two of the big guys, Saint Basil, the famous Saint Basil, where he was ordained a lector, and Saint Gregory Nazianzen, who ordained him a deacon. And so, and he studied in Constantinople and became very well versed in Greek philosophy and the budding theology that was taking place there. So his dates are 345 to 399. Now, with Evagrius, he ran into a bunch of problems in Constantinople and left that area and went down to Jerusalem, where there was a very well-known monastery that was who followed again Neoplatonic philosophy and their spirituality, and especially the person of many of you know named Origen, who lived in Alexandria and was developed the first real theology from a Greek point of view, a Christian theology. Now, Origen, this is around the year 200 and so, and he was a prolific writer, and came up with several writings on spirituality, and some of them are very beautiful, based on the scriptures. But as I say, he was influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy. So why is this an issue? Well, Neoplatonism has its own idea of what happened at creation. And basically, some of you I'm sure know this, the idea was that at the beginning of eternity, if I can use that phrase, there was the divine was one entity, completely spiritual. The divine, in other words, everything about the divine was spiritual, and that is the essence of things. But what happened was some of the aspects of the spiritual divine were, what we would now call angels and demons, decided to break off from the divine. And because of this, they lost their original divinity in a sense. And some of them who were still faithful are the angels, but the others who departed from that region became the demons. And there was another group who were in the middle, and this was the future humans. And so why did that break take place? Well, they have all these theories, and part of it is the idea that, don't laugh at this, that they were bored. So what happened then is the spiritual beings who didn't sin as badly were now not able to function because they broke off from the divinity. And so the divinity, out of its own, love of everything that it's creating, gave them bodies. And so the idea here is that, to put it in simple terms, the human soul originated from eternity, but in time, the original soul appears in a body. And so why? Well, now the original, as I said, the original soul is unable to know or function. So it needs a body to re-educate it, to get it back to its spiritual condition. And so the purpose of the body is to be a portal into God's material world, and through contemplation of God's material world, to be re-educated. And ultimately, there was one soul that didn't sin, human soul, and that was the soul that became the incarnate Christ. And so the idea here is that the incarnate Christ is the one who offered the final knowledge that for the soul to work its way back to divine wisdom and so forth. But the problem is that when the soul has been re-educated, and dies, there is no body that goes with it. And so the idea here is that the body only lasts as long as the human is alive. And now you have the soul alone who ends up in eternity. Well, Origen was condemned by the church, and but Evagrius continued that thinking. Now, again, it's not as simple as I presented it, but as I say, Origen still uses biblical and theological ideas such as the incarnate Christ himself is still existing in eternity. But as I say, I keep trying, and I can't find anywhere where he is saying that the body is involved at all. And so this is what makes Evagrius suspect, and was condemned in many ways. However, when Evagrius left Jerusalem, he went to the Egyptian desert, where all the new recent hermits and monasteries were being founded, and he spent the rest of his life there. And he was very educated, cultured person, and wrote extensively about the spiritual life, and also provided a lot of system and methodology about how the spiritual life is to be lived. And so, to get back to my point, the teachings of Evagrius became very attractive to the Syriac monks and hermits. And so Evagrius's ideas, especially when it comes to talking about the ascetical life and the contemplative life, a lot of his ideas were incorporated into the writings of the Syriac well-known spiritual writers. And so you have him influencing almost everyone in the Syriac world. Now, regarding the Syriacs, my theory is, and I'm not a scholar about everything that is everything, in the Syriac world, they did not follow Evagrius as far as the future of human beings. In other words, human beings do end up with a glorified body. You find this, of course, with John the Solitary, but for the other spiritual writers. So they adopted his methodology, but they did not adopt his philosophy. So when you get to Evagrius, he comes up with his own stages of the spiritual life, and basically he takes Origen's triple division, and he comes up with his own Greek names. And so for him, he talks about the practicae, which has to do with the ascetical life, the gnosis or theoria, which has to do with contemplative life, and the theologia, which has to do with mystical union with God. So these are his three ways of explaining the stages of the spiritual life. Now, I just want to give you some ideas of what he was up to before I run out of time. For him, the basic idea of the first level, the practicae, is to achieve this harmony between body and soul. And so for him, the whole role of asceticism is to follow all of the commandments, and to apply great discipline, discipline of not just the commandments, but of fasting and and prayer and vigil and so forth, and apply all of these tools in order to have this harmony between body and soul. So, as I mentioned earlier, how does the body and soul reach this harmony? And one of the terms he comes up with is that the goal of the spiritual life on the ascetical stage is to start off with with faith and with fear of God. And once one does that, the goal here is to reach what he calls apatheia. Now, apatheia, we have the word in English, apathy, but that's not quite what he means by that. For him, apatheia is because of your disciplining your body, you reach a point where your passions are there, still in your body, but they don't bother you anymore. It doesn't mean, again, that you run out of steam. It means that you have such a discipline now that you know they're there, but now you've reached a level where you can live with that. Maybe a dumb example I can use is like the pilot light in your oven. The pilot light is there, but nobody has turned it up any higher. And so the idea here is that if you reach apatheia, now your spirit, your soul is able to function and be freed from all the temptations and other things that go on from your body, from your senses, and so forth. So, so for him, then you've reached a certain level of calm, a certain level of serenity, where you can function properly. Now, he comes up with in one of his major works is called the Practicos, and he says that you start with faith and fear of God, but faith leads and fear of God leads to observing the commandments, and observing the commandments and discipline and so forth leads to apatheia, and apatheia gets you to agape. So from apatheia, you reach the level of love. So this is the basic way he puts it, that the real goal, of course, is love, but to reach that level of love, which is a transcending love, not just love on a very basic level, you have to go through this whole process. So this is how he understands, the beginnings of the stages of the spiritual life. Now, I just want to make one other comment about that. We're going to cover more of this level of the practique next time, where we talk about what you all know about the 7 capital sins, but actually Evagrius came up with 8. And so we're going to get into that a little more. But the thing to remember here is that while we talk about 3 stages, you don't go, it's not like going through high school, college, and grad school. It's your partner is successful at one stage, and so you're ready for the next stage, but you can always fall back again. So it's the spiritual life is a little more complex than that. But we have to go into these different stages. So I can stop here and open up the questions.
Thank you, Father. That was very interesting. If anyone has any questions, comments, feel free to put it in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute and ask the question directly, you are welcome to as well.
Chorbishop, if I may.
Sure.
So just so I have it straight, you're saying when you try to synthesize the various Syriac writers, you find this common theme of three stages of spiritual development, but each one of these spiritual leaders may have a different twist or different take on what each of the three levels are. Is that correct?
Yes, but what I'm saying here is that with Evagrius, it's not clear that there is a resurrection of the body. So with him, he's talking about in other words, the soul lived from eternity, and here on earth, if you've studied Plato and so forth, here on earth, the soul in the body is like a bird in a cage. The body is necessary so that you can educate yourself about how to become a purified soul again. So the body, as I say, becomes like a school for you. And so the point here is that the body is disposable, and the soul is eternal. Eternal in the sense, not just eternal in the sense of, if I'm not mistaken what he's saying, that the soul loses its identity in eternity. It becomes just part of the all again. So that you don't even have, in a sense, I could be wrong, your own identity once eternity takes place. Whereas in the biblical view, the resurrection of the body is essential, and that's why we have the creed ending up the way it does. So that makes a big difference in that sense.
Right. Well, I think that's what I'm saying, that each author has their own interpretation of what these three stages are, but I think you're saying they all seem to agree that there are three distinct stages of spiritual growth, if I may.
Let me follow. You're absolutely right. What I'm saying here is that even when you're studying Evagrius, he will talk about this mystical experience and so forth. For him, that this is quite understandable, because that's where the soul really belongs. But that's not the way we talk about it, coming back from the idea that the body is our partner in all of this. So as I said, his methodology was adopted, but it doesn't coincide with what we find in the scriptures.
I just have a comment and a question. If it doesn't coincide with what we find in the scriptures, then what is the purpose of our discussion?
Well, to learn more about his method, which is so his method can be a tool. In other words, a lot of the spiritual Syriac writers use this idea of how do you achieve contemplation, as a method. Where if you just eliminated anything that was influenced by Evagrius, you wouldn't have that material. My point is, it doesn't harm you. It actually helps you, as long as you know that some of the things he says will not be helpful. Evagrius uses all the scriptures. He has a lot that's helpful when it comes to how do you achieve contemplation. So for him, in fact, for Evagrius, the scriptures are how God is re-educating human beings. So he's completely focused on the scriptures. But my point is, it's just like with Origen. if you read Origen's commentary on the Song of Songs, it's a beautiful piece of work, beautiful, where the soul is seen as the bride of Christ and so forth. And people read the song commentary and other commentaries of Origen, and they benefit from it spiritually. But I was just pointing out that philosophically, and really when it comes to this doctrine, what we're saying here is that the glorified body aspect is not found there. Evagrius, all the ones who follow Evagrius spend most of their time, I'm talking about the Syriac writers, trying to help their monks and brothers and so forth, how to meditate on the scriptures. So that's what I'm trying to point out. It's not something that is of no use. It's very valuable, but there's some problems with the teaching. As I say, a lot of people read Origen, and Origen was condemned by the local churches, and later on by the Universal Church.
So you would need someone who is a little bit more advanced to help you to filter the stuff, or you think it's obvious?
No, it's if I didn't bring this up, you wouldn't even know. I mean, if I never mentioned what ended with where Evagrius ended up with, you wouldn't even know that Evagrius had a teaching differing from the teaching of the Universal Church, because everything that he wrote as such is very beautiful.
So I have a different question. You spoke about the body, soul, and spirit, and I think the body is obvious, and the soul is like the form of it gives form to the body, and it's I think it's a beautiful place where we can also encounter God. But I'm just also wondering, when it comes to the spirit and kind of breaking it down, just for the differences, for those that are not familiar, are you able to like kind of define what you mean by spirit, soul?
Yes, that's very important to keep reminding me of that. Let me come at it from a different direction, and I've done this before. Is a mystical experience possible for human beings? Either it is or it isn't. But how does a mystical experience take place? In other words, that you really have crossed over into the invisible. It has to take place somewhere within the human anthropology. And the reason I talk all the time about body, soul, and spirit is because St. Paul does that. And it's not original with St. Paul. It was the thinking of the time, even among the philosophers, that the soul, from the way they approach it, is almost how we talk about the animal soul. Ephrahat talks a lot about the animal soul. The spirit, as I've said before, and I have to use poetry here, is actually a participation in the Holy Spirit. And so this is where we cross over. It's the portal. So the idea here is that for human beings who never get to that point in their prayer life, you really are not using the spirit. It's there, but you're not using it. That's why you function with your soul. And that's why, see, in the Western theology, they hardly ever talk about it that way. But I think that that's unfortunate, incomplete. So you talk about body and soul. But as I say, when you read the Syriac writers, they talk about body, soul, and spirit. Now, in my own writing, like the infamous book I just wrote, I try very hard to say that in the core of our soul is where we reach the level of the spirit. And again, the only way you can function on that level is when you somehow self-transcend. And so if you just say body and soul, that's not good enough. Because when we say the soul is immortal, and that's fine, but really becomes problematic because when you talk about a glorified human, I presume there's going to be more to it than the soul. And so that's why I'm talking about that region. And believe me, when I wrote the book, and it's not that great a book, when you reach that region, you have to use some kind of language to say it's more than just something that is eternal to that, in that sense, but something that is higher than we normally think about. And so for me, you have a union of the Holy Spirit and your soul, and that union is what I refer to as your spirit. Does that help?
Yes.
So just a last comment. So in the Gospel of Luke, when our Blessed Mother in the Magnificat says, "My soul magnifies the Lord, my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior." To kind of break that open, is that what you're kind of that we're?
That certainly would be an example. That certainly, again, you can. It all depends. You know, your biblical scholars can interpret the language there and the Greek and all that. But that certainly is a very good example, and obviously the Blessed Mother is the full template of what a human being is. I even use that regarding the incarnate Christ, but incarnate Christ, of course, you have the divinity. But the Blessed Mother is our greatest example of soul and spirit.
That makes me think of the Immaculate Conception. Being the Immaculate Conception, everything in her soul is in perfect unity with God. So that soul can go to in her spirit. She is completely united, where we aren't, because we have our body that just keeps messing us up, and we commit little sins all the time.
Well, please understand the distinction between the human condition after original sin, and we have the fact that we speak about original sin. Please understand, is the fact that we do not have this handicap that original sin is. I always try to tell students that actually the whole way we stress the original sin is kind of gives us a reason to say, well, like we once had this comedian who would always say, the devil made me do it. So when we say original sin, even in the Council of Trent, it says that original sin inclines us to sin, but we didn't do anything. We didn't do anything. You and I didn't do anything. We are born and we have original sin because of a distant relative went and did what he did. So don't actually, in a sense, the Blessed Mother had an advantage over us, because this all happened before she was even born, at the time of conception. So I love the Blessed Mother, believe me, but I'm just trying to say, give us humans a break here. We didn't do anything. She was chosen by God, and Saint Ephrem is very big on this, as a perfect vessel, and so God made it that way. But give us humans a break. I hope you don't mind my humor.
I appreciate it. That's great. Thank you for sharing your good questions and your comments. I think we're going to wrap up here. And Father, if you don't mind closing us in a blessing, that would be great.
Sure. Blessing of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, descend upon you and preserve you from all evil. Amen.
Amen.